Alrighty, history fans, welcome to the very first lecture in History 119. This is a class examining modern American consumer culture. We are defining the modern period in U.S. history as the period that spans from the late 19th through the early 21st century. And in lectures to come, we'll examine that time period in relation to the development of a consumer economy and consumer culture. We begin that process here today with our very first lecture, when we'll examine a period known as the Gilded Age, which spans from the 1870s through the 1880s and into the early 1890s. And as it is a period in the late 19th century, when we begin our study of the modern era, it can be seen as the period that marks the beginning of a modern American consumer culture. So we begin our study of modern consumer culture in the first time period under review, this period known as the Gilded Age, which arguably can be seen as the beginning point of modern American consumer culture. Before we dive into the Gilded Age and the origins of consumer culture, let's begin this lecture and begin this class by introducing two ways of making sense of this history, the rise of a consumer culture. In the way in which historians have studied this phenomenon, this development, two overarching ways of making sense of, interpreting this history have emerged. Furthermore, not only have these perspectives and arguments influenced the historiography, the writing and representation of the history of consumer culture prevailed, but these ways of thinking have also prevailed at the time among critics during this era. So we are again examining the modern American period, a period that spans from the late 19th through the early 21st century. And as we go across that period in lectures to come, we'll see that throughout that period, there were contemporary critics at the time, who appraised, remarked upon, often criticized the development of consumer culture along these two ways of thinking. So these two dominant ways of thinking have prevailed in historiography, the way historians have made sense of this development, and they've also prevailed among people who lived through this development, this experience of a consumer culture developing at the time. The first of these two dominant ways of thinking, which we will encounter almost in every lecture as we go forward, can be described as the triumphalism narrative or the triumphalism argument. And it ultimately takes a positive approach to the development of a consumer culture, arguing that the development since the late 19th century of a consumer culture has been a good thing for the vast majority of Americans in a number of ways. It offers greater and greater opportunities to engage with the pleasures of the marketplace, access to modern inventions, modern machines, modern technologies that have improved the lives, standard of living, and experiences of most Americans. Furthermore, not only do these gadgets, gizmos, material goods offer higher standards of living, greater opportunities, furthermore, cultural expressions that have become available in this consumer culture, movies, sports, television, have also provided fields of meaning, fields of expression that are ultimately good for Americans. So the triumphalism narrative, the triumphalism argument that is voiced by some historians who have studied this consumer culture develop over the last 150 years, and people who lived through that experience, is one that describes the rise of a consumer culture ultimately as a good thing, in that it offers more expressions, more opportunities, more pleasures, more ultimately positive experiences for Americans in this age. The other perspective can be described as the domination thesis, and it argues that the development of a consumer culture over the last 150 years has been a bad or pernicious development in a number of ways. One, the development of a consumer economy has concentrated greater and greater power and wealth in the hands of a few industrialists, and maybe today we would say tech companies, that ultimately creates a great cleavage, great divide between rich and poor, those with resources and those who are denied resources. So one element of the domination thesis is that development of a consumer economy and consumer culture has ultimately perpetuated inequities in wealth and power. Another argument of the domination thesis is that so much of what defines our consumer culture and the expressions that come with it has been used to perpetuate racism, sexism, patriarchy, other cultural ideas and expressions that also work to maintain inequities in wealth and power. Another element of the domination thesis, in addition to its critique of the inequities that a consumer culture and economy have created, includes the way in which such a consumer-based orientation in our minds limits our creativity, our ability to imagine other possibilities. It seems to argue that material wealth, material success, consumerism is an apex of human development, an ideal we should strive for, and that forecloses other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other notions of success, reward, satisfaction. One element of the domination thesis is that consumerism convinces us that the great ideal of life is a house in the suburbs, a car in the garage, and spending our days staring at screens, and that forecloses different possibilities and opportunities of worth, of value in our lives. It ultimately makes us captive to things that are empty, unfulfilling, superficial, which itself is pernicious, but furthermore, it limits the ways in which we could pursue different ideals as a society and create different ways of being that could be more fulfilling. So the domination thesis has many different elements to it. It argues that a consumer culture is ultimately responsible for maintaining inequities in wealth and power. A consumer culture is often used to advance ideals and arguments steeped in racism, sexism, homophobia. And the domination thesis argues that the reward for a consumer culture is no reward at all. That the material goods, the consumer objects, the gadgets and gizmos that we so strive for ultimately are unsatisfying, unfulfilling, and leave us empty inside, which is particularly troubling for those who articulate this domination thesis, because in the mad pursuit of the latest gadget and gizmo, we are not only unfulfilled, but we have lost an opportunity to pursue other structures and fields of meaning that could be more satisfying. So we have here these two ways of thinking, the triumphalist narrative and the domination narrative, as we go forward in this first lecture and in lectures to come. As we examine this development of a modern consumer culture, you will hear both of these arguments in our class, articulated by people who lived through these developments and by historians who have sought to make sense of and interpret the development of this key aspect of modern American history. You'll hear it in my lectures, as I am the historian tasked with teaching you the history of modern consumer culture this quarter. And you'll again encounter it in the various historical figures, actors that we will encounter in this class who, at the time of these developments, whether it's the Gilded Age or the early 21st century, try to make sense of this key aspect of American life. And what this indicates is beyond just modes of thought and ways of thinking about consumerism and ways that you yourself may be convinced of or apply in your own understanding of consumer culture. Beyond that, beyond just fields of thought and ways of thinking about consumerism, what the development of these two arguments offers to us is what is at the heart and core of this class. Consumerism is more than just engagement with physical objects. It's more than just the center of the modern American economy. It is a field of expression. It is cultural. This class is about modern American consumer culture. It's not necessarily a class about a consumer economy, though of course we'll encounter that history as it's vital to our story. But because the focus is on culture, what we're really interested in this class is the body of ideals, values, meanings that we attach to consumer goods. A body of values, meanings, identities that some see as good and positive, the triumphalist narrative, others see as troubling and pernicious, but regardless of what ideology, perspective you embrace, find convincing, regardless of what point of view prevails at any moment, as we'll see at various times in American history, one of the two does tend to have greater sway. There are periods, as we'll encounter, where Americans are increasingly convinced of the triumphalist narrative, and then there is an ebb and flow where the domination thesis will ultimately prevail. But regardless of what ideology you embrace, and regardless of what particular ideology of the two may prevail at any historical moment, they both demonstrate the way in which we, through interpretation, through making sense of consumerism, freight it, load it with cultural meaning and significance. It's about those values. It's about those meanings. It's about those identities that we attach to consumer goods that ultimately urge us to see it as good or bad. Okay, that first slide was conceptual, a way of thinking about all that you are to learn in this class. Here in this next slide, we're going to talk about the first time period under review in the class, the Gilded Age, and talk about how that is arguably the very first time in which a modern consumer economy, and with it consumer culture, develops. Why would we say that it's this period, the Gilded Age, the 1870s, the 1880s, when a consumer culture for the first time develops? Well, there are some key attributes of the Gilded Age, and in particular, the economic changes of this period that help us understand this as the foundation and beginning of the modern consumer culture in American history. Key attributes include how the Gilded Age was a period that historians describe as a second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution began in the early 1800s, the early 19th century, in northern states prior to the Civil War. It began in northern states in the early 1800s as those states transitioned from a rural farm-based economy to an urban industrial economy. How those states slowly but steadily shifted from an economy centered on people farming to instead an economy centered on people living in cities, working in factories, selling their time for money in the new system of wage labor. That's the first industrial revolution. It begins in northern states prior to the Civil War. The Civil War, in part, is a clash between two different labor systems. Wage labor, which developed as part of that first revolution in the North, and slave labor, the predominant labor system in the South. Well, at the end of the Civil War, slavery is abolished, and that meant that in the late 19th century, after the Civil War, in this Gilded Age period, that is our focus here in our first lecture, the whole of the nation, North and South, would transition to an industrial economy. And that's what makes this the second industrial revolution. Now, with slavery abolished, all of the nation, North and South, East and West, would transition into an industrial economy where Americans live in cities, work in factories, and sell their time for money. So this is one reason why we can say a modern American consumer culture develops in the Gilded Age for the first time, because it is really the beginning of the totality of the nation, transitioning slowly but steadily to an industrial economy. In the early 1800s, most Americans live in rural areas and are employed in farming. At the end of the 19th century, in 1900, most Americans live in cities and work in factories. So the story, writ large, of the American economy in the 19th century is the transition from farm to factory, from rural to industrial. Prior to the Civil War, that process is confined to the North. After the Civil War, the whole of the nation transitions from an agrarian farm-based economy to an industrial economy. By 1880, right there in the throes of the Gilded Age, the majority of Americans now worked in industry, no longer farmers, no longer part of that older economy centered on small-scale agriculture. With industrialization came urbanization, people living in cities. With industrialization, a focused form of economic activity, one that's often connected to sources of power, rivers that would initially power turbines for factories. With that concentration of economic activity, you had a concentration of human beings for the first time in urban areas. And so urbanization is deeply connected to industrialization. With industrialization, with the transition to factory labor, you now had concentrated in urban areas a wage-earning labor force who every day, often 6 days a week, went to a factory to perform wage labor, mass-producing manufactured goods. So you have this slow but steady shift towards an industrial economy, and with it, the concentration of people in urban areas. In the 19th century, people are being pushed off the land, off farms. Their labor no longer needed as they're replaced by machines like McCormick reapers and John Deere tractors. Where did those people go? Well, they went to cities to work in factories. By 1900, at the end of the 19th century, the majority of Americans now live in cities. So the story of the 19th century is a story of industrialization, and with it the story of urbanization. People being pushed out of rural areas into cities, immigrants from around the world coming to American cities to work in factories. And this is key, this is causal, this is important in the story of a consumer culture, because with urbanization, with this highly concentrated population located in urban areas, you not only had a workforce that was mass producing consumer goods, but you have a marketplace for those consumer goods. You have a captive audience of people who will consume the manufactured goods, as well as the variety of amusement and entertainment elements of a consumer economy and culture. As we'll talk about here in this first lecture and throughout the class, consumerism means more than just buying a tangible good. It means going to a vaudeville theater. It means going to a movie, a baseball game, or today, downloading and watching a film off Netflix. Consumerism, what you consume, is often as much a form of expression and entertainment as it is a tangible good. And so with urbanization, you had now a concentrated population of people who would be active consumers of not just tangible goods, but a variety of experiences, expressions in American popular culture. So one of the reasons why the Gilded Age stands as the origin point of a consumer culture, industrialization. Another, urbanization. And another factor in this being really the foundation beginning point of the class and the beginning point of a consumer culture is that in this period of the 1870s, 1880s, early 1890s, the period that we describe as the Gilded Age, you have for the first time a nationwide network of communication and transportation that binds together the whole of the nation as a community of consumers. In the 1870s, a transcontinental railroad is completed, which allowed goods, people, ideas to circulate from New York to San Francisco. In the late 19th century, the development of the telephone, the expansion of telegraph services, the development of communication and transportation means that allow people, goods, and ideas to circulate in ways never seen before and have the effect of binding together the whole of the nation as collective receivers of goods, images, and ideas. By the late 19th century, you had newspapermen who owned dozens of newspapers who could publish a newspaper article and it would be read by readers from New York to Atlanta to Chicago to San Francisco, bound together as a collective body of receivers of information. By the late 19th century, goods could be sent from New York to Chicago to San Francisco. By the late 19th century, you could communicate over that broad expanse of space, binding together the nation in a brand new way. National brands emerge, Ariosa Coffee, Coca-Cola, Levi's, so that you have this collective experience of consumerism that really serves to bind people together in a common cultural experience. So these are large-scale factors in technology, in economics, in society, that served to bind together people in a common now industrial marketplace. And that's why, again, we can see the Gilded Age as the origin point for a modern consumer culture. And from the very beginning, these developments urged Americans to see these changes as good, as positive, the triumphalist way of thinking, that a new age of railroads, telephones, automobiles, and cinema was a new age of wonder, possibility, opportunity, a new modern age dawning. When America is concussively awash in these changes, when more and more Americans find themselves living in cities, working in factories, encountering a dizzying and frenetic era of technological change, Americans are urged to see all of these trends as good and positive. That science, technology, modernity were bringing about new opportunities, new expressions, that this new age of cities, factories, department stores, telephones, automobiles, motion pictures was a period of great opportunity, a period of wonder and delight. When America is awash in these changes, Americans are urged to see them as good and positive, change itself as good and positive, are urged to see science and technology as handmaidens of a new age of opportunity and possibility. So as Americans experience these frenetic changes in the economy and society, along with it comes a sense that these are good, that science and technology are making a new and wonderful age, demonstrative for us here of how from the very beginning, the origin point of consumer culture, Americans were urged to see these as good and positive. And ultimately, that becomes written into our language. You can see it in dictionaries of the American English language in the late 19th century, this idea of consumerism, consumption as a positive, as an inherent good in the very language we use. Because in the late 19th century, in dictionaries in the American English language, a new definition of the word consumption is included for the first time that offers a very different meaning, a now positive meaning attached to that word. Prior to the definition of consumption that we're most comfortable with, associated with the buying and procuring of goods for one's needs and pleasures, the term consumption that we would use throughout this class and will do so, prior to that definition of consumption, the procuring of goods for one's wants and desires, the other definitions that had preceded it were negative. Consumption, prior to the late 19th century, prior to the Gilded Age, prior to these developments were enunciated here in this slide that are, again, couched and expressed as inherently good, inherently positive, crackling with all sorts of opportunities. Prior to that, consumption had a very negative meaning in American language because it was a colloquial term for tuberculosis. The consumption of one's lungs as one was besieged by that disease. If you read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as a child, and Huckleberry Finn's pap is described as having consumption or suffering from consumption, it didn't mean he had credit card debt. It's not that idea of consumption. It's used by Twain in that novel, as it was in that period of the late 19th century, as a way of expressing a deadly disease. So one definition of consumption that prevailed prior to this new definition appearing was very negative. It referred to a deadly disease that consumed your lungs. The other way consumption would be used prior to this new modern definition was also negative and associated with death, destruction, and catastrophe. It referred to fire and the way in which buildings were often subject to being consumed by flames. When cities developed in the 19th century, as America slowly but steadily urbanized, most buildings were made of wood until the late 19th century with a greater availability of steel and concrete. And that meant that cities were very vulnerable to fires. You may be aware of the Great Chicago Fire, the 1870s, where the city burned for days after, yes, Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicks over a lantern. And that's because Chicago, like most American cities in the 1870s, saw most of its buildings still made of fire, so that fire could spread very quickly from one wooden building to another. And so fires were very common, and they were described using the term consumption, a building consumed by flames, a body consumed by flames. So prior to the modern definition of consumption, that term was associated with tuberculosis and death and destruction by fire. But what we see in the Gilded Age is a brand new definition of consumption, expressed for the first time in dictionaries of the American English language, the definition of consumption we would use today. That idea of securing goods for one's own wants and desires, a very positive association now of this term that had previously been associated with death and destruction. And that indicates, again, the cultural values, the cultural meanings associated with the now consumer economy in a period where America has now fully gone from agriculture to industry in a new age of railroads, telegraphs, telephones, automobiles, cinema, department stores, elevators. Americans were encouraged to see these developments in the consumer economy as cultural and, in particular, positive, meaningful. A new age of optimism and opportunity. That's why it is this period of the Gilded Age, this period of a second industrial revolution, that we can see as the origins of modern American consumer culture, a consumer culture that from the very beginning tended to see these developments as good. It's one thing to talk about the second industrial revolution in big macro terms of industrialization, urbanization, but most Americans experience those big macro trends in a much more immediate and personal way, an intimate way. And in this slide, I'll give you a few examples of that, which demonstrates to us how most Americans experienced these trends in their daily lives and came to associate these trends with the good, the positive. Now, in our own lifetimes here in the early 21st century, we've experienced a dramatic technological and economic change that is comparable to the dramatic concussive economic and technological changes of the late 19th century. In the previous slide, I talked about new technologies, new elements of the economy that transformed the lives of millions of Americans. And we, in our own lifetimes, have experienced something comparable in the computer age, in the shift from an industrial economy to a now post-industrial, information-based economy. In our final lectures here in the class, we'll talk about how that developed in the late 20th century and continues to this day. So we have lived through something very similar to what Americans lived through in the 1870s and 1880s, simultaneously a massive economic change coupled with massive technological change. The way in which you will make a living is very different than the way in which your parents and grandparents made a living. The technology that is part of your daily life is so different and alien to your parents and grandparents. You've probably had this experience of trying to explain something like VR or TikTok to your grandmother, and she looks at you like you have a third eye, right? So we can relate to the Gilded Age. It's very comparable to our own experiences because we too are living through a remarkable economic and technological shift. What we've experienced is very similar to what Americans experience in the dizzying and frenetic changes of the 1870s and 1880s. And when we've experienced the technological changes of the computer and internet revolution, when we've experienced the economic changes of the now gig economy, post-industrial, service sector, information-based economy, we've experienced it on the personal and intimate level. Your phone is in many ways your life. Your field of expression might be your YouTube channel or your Instagram account. You've engaged in the technological and economic changes in your life in a very intimate and personal way. And that's true as well for Americans during the Gilded Age. In this slide, we'll talk about how they experienced industrialization, experienced technological change, experienced the development of a consumer economy and culture in a very intimate and personal way that also stands as so comparable to our own lives here in the 21st century. One example of this can be found in the career of Gustavus Swift. Gustavus Swift was an immigrant, came to America, and ultimately helped to change the modern American diet. He opened a meat packing company in Chicago which still is in operation today and still bears his name, Swift Foods. You might have in your refrigerator or freezer right now some Swift food products. That company is still around today, was founded in the Gilded Age by Gustavus Swift, and he pioneered a way of connecting ice-cooled railroad cars, like the one seen here, to a network of ice-cooled warehouses around the nation, where he could ship from his hub, from his center in Chicago, meats ready to eat to markets all around the nation. So the story of Gustavus Swift is a story of industrialization, urbanization, and technological change, all those big macro trends we talked about in the previous slide. His meatpacking company was centered in a city, Chicago, which was really the heart of the meatpacking industry in America in the late 19th and most of the 20th century. Chicago has many nicknames: the Windy City, the Second City, the City of Big Shoulders. But one of its nicknames in the late 19th century was Porkopolis, because of all the little piggy wiggies who went to their doom in the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Joining Gustavus Swift were men like Philip Armour and Oscar Mayer, who also set up their headquarters in Chicago. So his story is a story of cities. It's a story of industrialization. Gustavus Swift and Mayer and Armour mass-produced hot dogs, sausages, pork chops in a very industrial, uniform line of production. They really helped create industrial meat. They helped create a new American consumer economy where meat was mass-produced in slaughterhouses in cities like Chicago. And his story is a story of a transportation revolution. His network of ice-cooled warehouses serviced every day by ice-cooled railroad cars. But furthermore, his story is a story of how all these trends, industrialization, urbanization, technological change, affected people on the intimate human level. And you can't get more intimate, more human, than what you eat, what you pop inside your mouth. Gustavus Swift changed how Americans ate. Thanks to his efforts, thanks to the economies of scale he could employ, thanks to the efficiencies that came with his utilization of new technologies like railroads, he could mass produce cuts of meat, ship them around the country, and outcompete local butchers. Much like today, Walmart can come into a town and with its economies of scale, with its use of new technologies, outcompete mom and pop operations and drive them out of business. Gustavus Swift did that for meat production in the late 19th century, and the net result of this was meat was cheaper and more accessible than ever, and with it, more and more Americans could consume meat thanks to the development of Swift Foods and its means of creating this consumer good. Prior to the efforts of Gustavus Swift, meat was expensive. It was the province of the wealthy. Only the wealthiest Americans could afford to eat meat every day or meat at every meal. But thanks to the cheap meat produced by Gustavus Swift and sent around the country, thanks to the way in which he could outcompete local butchers, now even working class Americans could afford the pleasures that came with eating meat. So his story is a story of how these big trends in the economy of industrialization, urbanization, technological change affected people on the intimate human level in the way in which they now literally consumed consumer products in this period. And with it allowed people a new opportunity to consume meat every day, even people of modest backgrounds. It urged them to see these trends as good because now they could live as the rich did and have meat every day. So Swift's story is also a story of how people came to see these processes as good, as positive, in offering them new opportunities, new pleasures, a chance to live as the rich live. And as a result, Gustavus Swift changed the American diet, making us what we remain to this day, a nation of meat eaters, where today in America we're not content to eat just one dead animal. We need 2 or 3 other dead animals stacked on top as we eat our bacon pastrami disaster burgers, right? Well, that modern American reality began here in the story of Gustavus Swift, and it is a story not just of macro trends in the economy, but a story of how those macro trends affected people on the intimate human level in their daily lives, in literally what they put inside their bodies in a way that encouraged them to see these trends as good. Another example of this, James Duke. James Duke invented a machine that could cut, roll, and paste 100,000 cigarettes an hour. He mass-produced tobacco in a way that Swift mass-produced meat. He, in his factory, mass-produced the modern American cigarette and then sent it on railroad lines around the country. He created some of the very first national brands of cigarettes, many of which are still sold to this day. And he, too, brought a consumer good that had once been rare and expensive tobacco to the masses. He offered a ready-to-smoke cigarette. Prior to the invention that Duke pioneered, if you wanted to smoke a cigarette, you had to go to a local tobacconist, buy tobacco, and when you were ready to smoke your cigarette, you had to roll your own cigarette, do that labor yourself. Now, today, they still sell those rolling papers at Circle K and the like for people who like to roll their own tobacco cigarettes. Of course, that's why they sell those, right? But prior to James Duke, that was your only way of smoking cigarettes. But Duke did that work for you in a distant factory, hundreds or thousands of miles away, with a machine that could cut, roll, and paste 100,000 cigarettes an hour. So Duke's story is again a story of industrialization, mass production, new technologies, a national marketplace for national brands of cigarettes. But it's also a story of how those trends affected people on the intimate human level, once again, literally in what they put inside their mouths. It's also a story, like with Swift, of taking a consumer good that had once been rare and expensive and bringing it to the masses. Now, even people of working class means could enjoy a cigarette. Prior to Duke's invention, tobacco was rare, expensive. Only the wealthiest Americans could enjoy a pipe after a meal. But now, James Duke pioneered a way of mass-producing tobacco, making it ready-made, ready to use, and bringing it to the masses, urging them to see these trends again as good, as means of offering new opportunities and expressions in one's intimate life to Americans swept up in the big trends of industrialization and urbanization in this period. Just like Swift made us a nation of meat eaters, Duke made us a nation of smokers, and we remain so until very, very recently. The America that you likely grew up in the last few decades has only recently become a nation where smoking is so uncommon and subject to such social scorn. It wasn't that long ago, though. Smoking was very common. Most American adults smoked well into the late 20th century. It wasn't that long ago. You could smoke on a plane. You had restaurants where people could smoke. So history urges you to imagine a different time. And it may be difficult for you to imagine this, but there once was a period not too long ago where we were a nation of smokers. That development begins here with the story of James Duke. Today, of course, smokers are pariahs. You know, if you want to smoke in America, you can only smoke in certain areas, what I like to call smokers' concentration camps, right? On our campus, we've banned smoking because, of course, nobody smokes on campus, right? You can never see that, right? Sure. If you want to see someone smoking on campus, you look for one of those signs that say smoke-free campus. That's where all the smokers hang out, right? We have laws today like you can't smoke in a bar. Why do people go to bars? To drink poison and solicit unprotected sex. But heaven forbid you do something unhealthy there, like smoke, right? You can't smoke on the beach. It's one big goddamn ashtray, but you can't smoke there, right? That's our contemporary reality, where today we have this very prohibitionist approach to smoking, but that is a very recent development, because for most of the modern period, we were a nation of smokers, and the story of James Duke helps us understand that development, as well as the way in which broader trends in the consumer economy urged Americans to embrace these trends as good and positive as these trends change their intimate personal lives. One last example. We all have our vices, and you might hear in my rather sympathetic account of the lives of smokers today that though I don't smoke and have never smoked in my life, I feel a sense of sympathy to smokers because they are such social pariahs today, even though every single one of us engages in some sort of unhealthy behavior. We all have our vices. And my vice, of course, is a drug that I do every day. Every day when I wake up, I start doing drugs. But my drug is a legal one, caffeine. And the patron saint of those like me who are desperate slaves to the drug of caffeine is John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle invented a machine that could mass roast, grind, and package coffee beans. He created the very first national brand of coffee, Ariosa, that was sold from New York to Chicago to San Francisco along the new network of communication facilitated by a transcontinental railroad system. So again, his story is a story of industrialization. He mass-produced coffee in factories. Technology. He invented a machine that could mass roast and grind coffee beans. A story of national goods, a national marketplace, national brands, and national technologies. But his story is also a story of how those big trends affected people on the intimate human level. What Swift did for meat, what Duke did for tobacco, Arbuckle did for coffee. Mass production, economies of scale, new efficiencies of production and distribution made coffee cheaper. Coffee, too, like tobacco and meat, had once been the province of the wealthy. Only the richest Americans could enjoy a cup of coffee after a meal. But Arbuckle brought it to the masses. He provided, in many ways, the lifeblood of the industrial age, because now when you worked at a factory 12, 14 hours a day, you needed some stimulation. And that came from tobacco and also from caffeine. That's why so many of us are slaves to caffeine in the now post-industrial age. And Arbuckle brought that experience to the masses, helping to again demonstrate for us, as we have attempted to do so in this slide, how this new industrial age, one of factories and railroads and new technologies, affected people on the intimate human level in a way that's very comparable to how we, in a time of economic and technological change, have experienced those trends on the intimate human level in our engagement with our phones, in our different platforms. That demonstrates how we experience the big trends of this age in an intimate human level, and the slide has labored to demonstrate for you how people in the 1870s and 1880s experienced the big macro trends in the economy and society as well on the intimate human level. And the net result of this was, as more and more Americans could eat meat, smoke cigarettes, and drink coffee, they were urged to see these trends as good and positive. Another artifact of the Gilded Age, another new thing that developed in the new industrial economy, urban way of living in this period, that urged Americans to see these trends as good and positive through the vector of consumerism, was the advent of the department store. First American department stores appear in American cities in the 1870s and the 1880s during this Gilded Age in places like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. A department store is a vanishing thing today, particularly now with the economy that we're all experiencing and the decline of brick and mortar retail. The department store may be soon a relic. The shopping mall may soon be a bygone institution. But the department store began in the 1870s and 1880s as a new thing, and it crackled with the excitement and opportunity of the consumer age. It was known as a department store because prior to the department store, if you wanted to buy furniture, books, clothing, you went to separate retailers to procure each and every one of those. To buy a hat, you went to the hat store. To buy furniture, you went to the furniture store. But a department store was one building that had all of that. A world of consumer goods under one roof, where you went into this one edifice, this one building, and could go from one department in that building to another so that you could buy clothing, shoes, books, and furniture all in one centralized location in an urban downtown area. So with industrialization came urbanization. With urbanization, as I stressed throughout this lecture, came a large population of people concentrated in one area, and therefore you had a bevy of consumers for these new ways of buying, these new ways of engaging in the consumer economy, the department store, where in a downtown area there was this one massive building comprised of many different floors, many different departments, where you could buy anything you could imagine, a world of goods under one roof. One marvel of the department store was that you could walk into this one building and see all of the various things to buy. It was again comprised of different departments, often different floors. Department stores were facilitated by the advent of steel, which allowed for the building of tall buildings, and the elevator, which was also pioneered in this period as yet another marvel in technology that allowed you to go up and down the different floors of the department store. And as you did so, you could, in one afternoon, engage with all sorts of goods, experiences. It was a way of simultaneously seeing all the different consumer goods that were available, and in doing so, being urged to see the world as comprised of things to buy. How do we imagine the world? How do we imagine the world today? It's not simply a matter of images from space, of Earth. What does the term world mean? Everything in the world. That's more than just the physical structure of a planet. It's more than just how we might conceptualize Earth. We use the word world in a very different way than simply a term used to describe the globe or the planet Earth. A world means a whole collection of things, all that you can imagine. The department store offered you a world of goods under one roof, and in doing so urged you to think of the world, all that is possible, all that can be encompassed, as comprised of things to buy. So the department store was a marvel. It was a new way of engaging in consumerism. It was a new technology, steel buildings stretching to the sky, defying the limits of gravity, facilitated by technologies like the elevator that move people up and down this remarkable edifice. But it was also a key artifact of the consumer culture that urged people to think in new ways through consumer goods, to understand who they are in a modern age in relation to consumerism, because it literally urged you to imagine the world, all that could be possible, all that could be encompassed, as a world of things that could be yours at your fingertips. Now, many Americans who went into these department stores, poor working class people struggling to eke out a living in the industrial age, couldn't buy these goods. They were far too expensive, but they could see them, they could imagine them, they could dream of them. Those identities, those dreams, those sources of what was possible, all here deeply informed by consumerism. It was in this period that what become mainstays of American retail emerged. Macy's in New York City, Marshall Field's in Chicago, the Jordan Marsh chain of department stores in Boston. So it's a story of urbanization. It's a story of, again, people concentrated in urban areas, a marketplace for goods and experiences. The department store responded to that marketplace with its edifices of consumer capitalism, these buildings, these monuments to the consumer experience. And from this come mainstays of American retail, many of which endure to this day, even with the transition now to online commerce. Macy's becomes synonymous in many ways with the urban New York experience. You don't even have to go in to the department store to get a heady dose of the consumer experience, as you could stare into the windows of these department stores and see a variety of goods. They change our sense of space and time. They were remarkable buildings that people would sometimes go in just to marvel at, not to actually buy anything. This is equivalent of today, going to the mall just to go to the mall. You're not there to buy anything. You're going there for the experience, and department stores offered an experience. That meant that you could engage with consumerism and the opportunities that consumerism offered, even if you didn't consume something, buy something. Because you could see the marble staircases and window displays and skylights and elevators. Many of these department stores had fountains and piano players. They were experiences. They were engagement opportunities with the modern, the possible, so that you didn't have to consume something to, again, get a heady dose and the opportunities that consumerism offered. Another consequence of department stores was one of abstraction. When you went into a department store and gazed upon all of these experiences, all of these gadgets, gizmos, and consumer goods, all of these goods under one roof, they existed there within the department store as if they landed from another planet. You didn't think about where they came from. There's this process of abstraction that comes in the ways in which department stores made invisible the labor that made these goods possible. When you went into a department store, all you saw were consumer goods. You didn't think about where they came from. In a pre-industrial economy, you engage with the people who produced the goods that you would ultimately consume. The artisan laborers who might produce your shoes, a local cobbler, a tailor who might tailor make goods, clothing just for you. But in a department store, the people who produce these consumer goods are hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away, people toiling away in factories, and you never encounter them. And so there's this process of abstraction that takes place. You abstract the labor. You don't see it. It's invisible. And therefore, the consumer goods that are right there in front of you, seemingly at your fingertips, have no origins. They seem to exist solely for your pleasure. When you walk into Best Buy today and you see an iPhone, iPad, gleaming, shining, it's as if it landed from another planet and it exists solely there for your pleasure, comfort, and engagement. You don't think about where it came from because that labor has been abstracted. When you do think about that labor, it's a bummer. You think about the sweatshops in China where people are paid a few pennies an hour to produce your iPad, your iPhone, and then consumer capitalism doesn't seem so fun. Consumer capitalism relies upon that process of abstraction where you don't think about where these goods came from. You don't think about the labor performed to make them possible. Instead, you only see them as sources of pleasure. That's the experience we might have today when we walk into an Apple store or Best Buy. But Americans in the 1870s and the 1880s, 150 years ago, could have that experience thanks to the department store. One last note about department stores that again speaks to the cultural meanings associated with them that often urge people to see the positivity, the triumphalist elements of this consumer experience. In a department store, they didn't just have a stack of chairs in a corner. They didn't pile up the consumer goods and you just walk by and grab one. They situated them. They created landscapes in many ways, livescapes, we might say, that you could just walk into. They taught us how to live in that way, that the couch was situated by the phonograph, that was situated by the chair, so that you could just walk right into that livescape. Much like today when you go to IKEA, they don't just have a pile of chairs in the corner or a pile of mattresses. They put the chair next to the sofa, next to the wardrobe, and you look at that and you say, I want that life to be my life. Well, that's again an experience we might have in the 21st century, but Americans could have that experience in the department store because the department stores pioneered that process of arranging consumer goods as a world to live in. And when Americans went into these department stores in the 1870s and 1880s and they saw this arrangement of consumer goods creating an entire world, they began to imagine again the world as what was possible as one defined by these consumer experiences. So the department store, along with the other developments in the Gilded Age, key artifacts of a consumer culture developing in this period, one that crackled with opportunity, positivity, new experiences. I've mentioned before, and we return to it here and throughout the class, that consumerism means more than just a tangible consumer good. It also refers to experiences. And the Gilded Age was also a time of new experiences, cultural expressions, entertainment, amusements that also urge people to invest culturally in this new consumer economy. In the late 19th century, you have a new form of entertainment, vaudeville, which again sprouts up in urban areas, catering to a captive audience, offering them a form of entertainment on their evenings off from the factory job or that one day off a week they might have. And vaudeville is in entertainment terms what the department store was in terms of consumer goods. The department store, as I stressed in the previous slide, was a world of goods under one roof. Vaudeville was a world of entertainment under one roof. You paid your very scant admission fee to go to the vaudeville theater, and in one evening's entertainment, you would hear music, see a comedian. There would be acrobats and animal acts, a variety of different forms of entertainment. Vaudeville's novelty, its appeal, was that in one evening you could see a variety of different forms of entertainment: song, dance, magic. Vaudeville was often the very first place people saw a brand new technology known as the motion picture, because it was integrated into vaudeville's night of entertainment. The night might begin with a comedian and then a music act, and then they would wheel out a kinetoscope and you'd watch the miracle of motion captured on film and projected onto a screen. So vaudeville offered you this bevy of experiences, many of them new, like the technology of motion pictures, under one roof. It complemented the investment that so many were making in a new modern age that seemed to crackle with all sorts of new opportunities that could be at hand for, in this case, a very small admission. Another form of entertainment that was common in the Gilded Age was the dime novel. Dime novel was a cheaply produced, lurid, often fantastical form of storytelling that was sold for, yeah, you can guess, a dime, 10 cents, meaning that it was available to even the poorest Americans. This was the predominant form of pop culture before the widespread availability of visual forms of pop culture like motion pictures, later radio, television. In the 1870s and 1880s, before cinema, radio, television, most forms of pop culture were print culture. And the dime novel was a key aspect of that because it, again, for a very small consumer price of 10 cents, offered you fantasy, offered you lurid, sensationalist stories of sex and violence, also offered you morality lessons that urge you to invest in this new consumer industrial age, the rags to riches stories that were so common in dime novels, stories of people who were born poor but through hard work, thrift, showing up on time, working hard, went from rags to riches, seemingly indicate that you too, poor American reading this dime novel, could also go from rags to riches. If you just work hard, show up on time, don't complain, the perfect morality message for a new age of industrial capitalism. So the dime novel offered escape, but it also offered other ways through these morality lessons, through these rags to riches stories, of being deeply invested culturally in terms of one's psyche, expectations, and identity in the new industrial age. Another form of print that was part of the popular culture of this age, mass-produced newspapers. Newspapers that were sold on street corners to industrial workers headed to their job in the factory. The predominant form of journalism in this era of newspapers was known as yellow journalism. And yellow journalism refers to sensationalistic stories of sex and violence that often urge you to plunk down your penny as you walked to your job in the factory and encountered vendors selling the broadsheet newspapers of this period. This was an accessible form of entertainment that offered you sordid tales from around the city, around the nation, around the world, stories that again crackled with sex and violence. One way to understand yellow journalism is as the origins of tabloid journalism, what lives on today in National Enquirer, in clickbait articles that convince you to click on them with stories of fat celebrities on the beach or other forms of sex, violence, and intrigue. That consumer culture, consumer experience that we recognize today in the tabloids sold in grocery stores, TMZ.com, or clickbait articles began here in the yellow journalist age, where, again, for a very small price, a few pennies, you could buy these broadsheet newspapers that beckoned to you and offered you those lurid stories of sex, violence, and intrigue. So in the Gilded Age, you had vaudeville, you had different forms of popular culture through print, like the dime novel and yellow journalist newspapers. And you also had other new forms of entertainment because it's this period that modern baseball emerges out of urban areas where local cities would field local teams to play against each other. Now, baseball has been around since the colonial period. It was previously a sport known as rounders, but the modern form of baseball that we recognize and its set of rules, as well as a modern American baseball culture centered on cities and teams associated with those cities, emerges for the first time here in the Gilded Age. Now, again, it's a form of entertainment. It's a form of entertainment deeply tied to urbanization because you had downtown ballparks built in this period and cities sponsoring teams. You were urged to identify with that team as part of your civic urban identity. But baseball also is complementary to the trend of industrialization as at the heart of the Gilded Age, because baseball is the ultimate sport of an industrial age. What you have here is 9 guys on a field, each in different parts of the field, all of whom have different jobs. It's like an assembly line. It's like in a factory where you have workers situated in certain parts of the factory doing the same job over and over again with a certain province, a certain field that is their responsibility. So baseball emerges out of these trends of urbanization and industrialization of the Gilded Age as a new form of entertainment, perfectly catering to this urban era with a captive marketplace of now ticket buyers. One last example of the different forms of consumer culture and leisure amusement of the Gilded Age, amusement parks like that represented here in the photograph of Coney Island. In the late 19th, early 20th century, urban amusement parks emerged, like Coney Island, which catered to the entertainment and amusement needs of New Yorkers. But most American cities had comparable amusement parks to Coney Island. Here in Southern California, leisure culture develops, centered on the sea, with many amusement parks located right there next to the beach. And Coney Island was like that in the late 19th century in New York. And so this becomes a national phenomenon in this age of national marketplaces and national experiences. These were amusement parks that catered to an urban audience located in urban areas, and one that, like vaudeville and the department store, offered a bevy of different delights and pleasures, from food to entertainment. Coney Island was a place you could go to and see sideshows, burlesque shows. It was very bawdy and sexual adult. It was a place where young people went to hook up. Young unmarried industrial workers, young women and men who had money in their pockets seeking entertainment and pleasure would meet at Coney Island. Because of that, it was often associated with danger and vice and pleasure. It invited the scorn of progressives and moralists, much like similar experiences today may do so. It was a place where unaccompanied women could, in many ways, engage in the wonders and delights of the urban age, and so there was a sense of danger and peril for women in this open social space. But the modern amusement park like Coney Island, another key artifact of the Gilded Age, one that again comes out of a new urban industrial economy, but brings with it such experiences, such pleasures and entertainment in the consumer realm. So far in this lecture, as we've summarized the Gilded Age, we've talked about the triumphalist way of thinking about the development of a consumer economy and culture in this period. But there is certainly a great deal of expressions in line with the domination thesis that we articulated in our very first slide. As I said in that slide, throughout the class, we'll encounter contemporary critics who voiced these arguments. So far, we've seen mostly the triumphalist side of this. People urge to see these trends as good and positive, offering new experiences, bringing wonders and delights to the masses. But the Gilded Age was also a period of intense critiques of a new age of industrial consumer capitalism. The term we're using throughout this lecture, Gilded Age, comes from Mark Twain, who in the Gilded Age wrote a novel titled The Gilded Age. And it was such a great descriptor of this period that historians have stolen it and used it to describe this period in American history from the 1870s through the 1880s. So the term Gilded Age doesn't come from historians, it comes from Mark Twain, the great astute critic of this age. The term gilded refers to a gloss, a sheen. It's a term from metallurgy, where you emboss something with gold and silver, so that on the surface it's brilliant, dazzling, connotes wealth, but all you have to do is scratch that surface, and you'll see what's underneath, the dark core. Twain used that term to describe America in the 1870s and 1880s, where on the surface everything looks dazzling and brilliant, but when you scratch the core, you see poverty, despair. You see that labor that often is abstracted in the department store, labor performed by children, the elderly, eking out a desperate living. So the very term we're using to describe this period is one of the critiques here voiced by Mark Twain, who found America at its core a dark and despondent place, despite the elevators, motion pictures, the new opportunities and expressions that lie simply on the surface. Others who critiqued this new era as one of anything but opportunity were labor unions that unionized industrial workers who found themselves impoverished, eking out a desperate living, unable to engage with many of the consumer opportunities and delights of this period. The Gilded Age was a period of intense acrimony between industrialists, factory owners, and their laborers. Strikes were common. Violent strikes were very common in this period. Strikes waged by labor unions who objected to the poor wages that people who worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, ultimately were paid. The terrible working conditions where people were routinely injured or killed on the factory floor. In the Gilded Age, there was no such thing as OSHA. There were few, if any, workplace safety measures. It was very common for people to lose an arm, a leg, an eye on the factory floor, and in doing so lose their livelihood. There's no workplace safety laws in place, no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation. There were no child labor laws, and it was very common in this period to see very small children, 5, 6 years old, working on the factory floor in dangerous conditions. And there's no Social Security, no pensions, no retirement of any sort for most Americans, so it was also very common for very elderly people to be working literally to their dying day. To address those inequities came labor unions who argued for higher wages, a higher standard of living, better working conditions, seeking a limit to what employers could demand with an 8-hour workday. They often clashed with employers, leading to a period of strikes, often violent, boycotts, a huge clash between the interest of the industrialists and the interest of workers, making the Gilded Age a period not just of acrimony between workers and employers, but a period where so many found themselves indeed on the underside of the American economy, on the underside of the American dream. That certainly was the case for Americans in urban industrial areas who found themselves eking out a desperate living, paid so poorly, living in desperate conditions. And it was also true for people in rural areas, farmers who increasingly found themselves squeezed in the new economy. And this led to a revolt of sorts in rural areas among farmers and ranchers who formed a third party in the 1880s, the Populist Party, which sought to be the voice of these Americans who found themselves on the underside of the American dream. They called as well for reform and change, an effort to regulate the titans of industry, the railroaders who often exploited farmers and ranchers, charging them exorbitant rates, the bankers who seemed to levy onerous interest rates on farmers who seemingly found themselves every year slipping further and further behind, earning less and less for their produce, and yet having to borrow more and more to secure some sort of living for themselves and their family. The Populist Party became the voice of that movement. They called for regulation of railroads, regulation of banks. They called for a graduated income tax that would tax the wealthy. Populist Party was the voice of these Americans who also found the Gilded Age economy anything but one of opportunity and pleasure. In American Christianity, a movement developed in the Gilded Age that also critiqued the excesses of greed, the excesses of an economy that seemed to work for the few at the expense of the many. This was known as the social gospel movement, and it too urged reform informed by Christian charity, informed by a collective sympathy among Americans and human beings as children of God, efforts to improve those who again found themselves on the underside of the American economy. What we have here in this slide is the other side of the debate. Americans ranging from literary critics like Mark Twain to industrial laborers to farmers to philanthropists and Protestant ministers who argued the Gilded Age is not an age of wonder, delight, and opportunity, that if you scratch that gilded exterior, you see the dark underside of the American dream, and we need instead an economy that works for the many rather than the few. These Americans who voiced this critique found this new age of industrialism, big business, urbanization as one stifling, limiting for the vast majority of Americans, demonstrative here of, again, the jousting, argument, and debate that concerned a new economy so centered on people living in cities, working in factories. Another group who voiced this argument were known as the muckrakers, and they were journalists who often exposed what went unseen. They were known as muckrakers because they raked up the muck and exposed the lives of the impoverished. They gave voice to the voiceless in this way. Key figure in the muckraker movement was Jacob Riis, who in 1890 published a book that still stands as a remarkable window into the lives of ordinary industrial American workers in the Gilded Age. His book was titled How the Other Half Lives, and it is full of essays regarding what Jacob Riis saw in the 1880s as he toured New York City and went into the tenement buildings, the apartments, the homes of those who found themselves working 6 days a week, 12, 14 hours a day, eking out a desperate living in the industrial economy. But much more consequential, impactful, were, in addition to the essays, the photographs that Riis took and published in this book. And that's really why this book really does stand as a documentary, as a repository of images that we still mine to understand what life must have been like in New York City, the American city, in this age of urbanization, in this Gilded Age. Here in the slide, you see one of the photographs which Riis took of young children asleep on the streets of New York, exhausted after a long 12-hour shift on the factory floor. As I mentioned earlier, this is an age where there are no child labor laws, no compulsory education laws, and so it was very common for children to work on the factory floor. Industrialists often actively sought to employ children because they could be paid less than adults, which was more profitable for factory owners. They're imagined to be more obedient, more tractable than adults, more likely to listen to adults. Not my children, but these children evidently. And their little arms were good for reaching into clattering machines and pulling off parts and bolts that had fallen off, meaning that children were often tasked with the most dangerous labor of all. And so it was very common for children to be on the factory floor, not only because industrialists liked to hire them for those reasons, but their labor was needed just to pay the rent, just to keep food on the table. In the Gilded Age, you had a family economy where every member of the family, from the children to the adults to the elderly, worked. And they worked because their labor was needed just to meet the minimum standards of living. Again, no child labor laws, no Social Security. You worked from birth to death. Jacob Riis exposed the consequences of this in photographs he took like this that demonstrate how these children here are sleeping in filth on the streets of New York, exhausted because their labor was so vital to their families. He shocked the nation with these images of the urban poor, people living in filth and squalor and tenement housing. He wanted to rake up the muck, expose what was unseen, and jar Americans out of the belief that this new age, this new industrial age, was one of opportunity, possibility, where you could go from rags to riches, where a bevy of wonders and delights were right there at your fingertips. Instead, Rees demonstrated how the other half lived. He demonstrated the underside of the American dream in an effort that he hoped would spark a debate about progress, modernity, what we should aspire to. How can we stand and say this is an age of progress and opportunity when we have children on the factory floor, when we have men and women losing an arm, an eye, a leg, as they eke out a desperate living? From the efforts of muckrakers, populists, labor unions would come a movement designed to ameliorate the great excesses of the Gilded Age, create an economy that worked for the many, not the few. Here were these pungent and powerful critiques of a Gilded Age that saw this as anything but an era of opportunity and possibility. Here is the other side of this debate regarding the development of a consumer economy and culture, one we associate with that domination thesis. In our next lecture, we'll talk about how this brings forward a new period in American history, the Progressive Era. From the 1890s through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the nation will be awash in reform efforts that respond to these pungent critiques levied by the critics of the Gilded Age. So, as I've mentioned here, as we'll demonstrate in the course of this class, you get often this argument, this debate, this vacillation, this ebb and flow between triumphalism, domination, periods where Americans embrace the consumer economy and then find it stifling, limiting. And the efforts of muckrakers and other critics would spark such a debate and a shift towards a more regulatory reform-minded period, which we'll examine again in our next lecture as we continue our survey of modern American consumer culture and modern American history. What is the remedy? How can we improve the lives of those on the underside of the American dream? That is the question that Rees and other muckrakers hope to prompt, and it would give rise to such an effort in the progressive movement and progressive era that, as its name indicates, sought to bring a different vision of progress that would right many of these imbalances and inequities so exposed by the muckrakers. But before we get to the progressive era, let's conclude our study of the Gilded Age with one more key figure from the triumphalist narrative, who in many ways anticipates what will prevail in the progressive era as Americans are dedicated to reform and change, remedying those inequities. This figure is Simon Patten, who was an economist in the Gilded Age, one of the founders of the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the very first business schools in American history. Today, the vast majority of majors and most universities are business majors or majors affiliated with business. But that's a pretty recent development because it wasn't until the late 19th, early 20th century that business even emerged as a field of study on college campuses. Patten was a key pioneer in that process, creating one of the very first business schools, the Wharton School, at an Ivy League school, the University of Pennsylvania, in the late 19th century. Wharton School, the alma mater of our current president, who, believe it or not, graduated from that institution with a degree in business. So Patten was an economist, a founder of the Wharton School, but he's valuable to us mostly here because of an essay he wrote in 1889, right there in the thickets and throes of the Gilded Age with all of its tumult, changes, and debates regarding a new consumer economy. The essay he wrote was titled The Consumption of Wealth. Now notice the term of consumption here used again in the way in which we'd associate it with the procuring of goods for one's needs and desires. In this essay, Patten argues there'll always be social divisions. There'll always be a divide between rich and poor. But with those divisions come problems because, one, the poor resent the lifestyle that the rich have, and two, even the rich themselves can never ever be satisfied through the goods and delights that are offered to them because human beings have this craving for novelty, this pleasure-seeking impulse that can never be fully satisfied. If you buy something, you like it in that moment, but over time, the pleasure you associate with that good diminishes. And so, these are the problems that Patton articulates in A New Consumer Age. One, we'll have this division between rich and poor, and that's bad because the poor resent the lifestyles, the consumerist lifestyle that the rich enjoy. But even the rich are unsatisfied because even when they are able to procure new gadgets and gizmos, over time those gadgets and gizmos wear off in terms of their ability to provide pleasure. His solution to these problems was, one, an ever new source of goods, innovations, technologies that could satisfy that pleasure-seeking impulse, and an effort to extend those consumer goods, always constantly refreshed, authorized, and employed, to the poorest Americans, so that poor people too could enjoy the goods, pleasures, and delights of a new modern economy. Patton was writing in 1889 when the nation was rocked by many clashes between workers and industrialists, social movements like the populist movement, which became the voice of the aggrieved, the voice of those seemingly left behind. And Patton feared social revolution. He feared social discord. His solution was to create a middle culture where rich and poor remain rich and poor. Again, he argued you always have rich and poor. You never have an age where everyone's rich. You never have an age where everyone's equal. He accepted social divisions based on wealth as a given. But if we could urge the poor to see themselves in league with the rich, in commonality with the rich, in experiencing the same pleasures, comforts, and delights by having access to consumer goods, you could iron out those divisions. You could create social harmony out of social discord that would end violent strikes, end boycotts, end social movements that sought to regulate and diminish the power of the wealthy. If poor people had access to consumer goods, if poor people had access to the wonders and delights of the industrial age, they wouldn't be angry. And they would accept their impoverished status because, well, they're happy, they're satisfied. And they would see the rich not as their foes, not as their enemies, not as the sources of their discontent, but people they shared a common experience with. How do we do this? Well, we extend the consumer economy, one that constantly refreshes, revitalizes, and offers new things satisfying that pleasure-seeking impulse to all. The reason why I offer Patton here as the concluding slide of our look at the Gilded Age is that he's really the pivot point into our next period, the Progressive Era. Because as we'll see in our next lecture, a Progressive Era that is the next period that follows the Gilded Age, one that was so dedicated, as its name indicates, by creating progress, will be an era that is really dedicated to extending consumerism to all and creating that middle culture that Patton so anticipated. Patton is an interesting figure because he sought a solution to an America of rich and poor, of social divisions, a solution that he found in a common culture where rich and poor would be bound together in a common experience of consumerism and the pleasures associated with it. And as we'll see, not just in our next lecture, but in many lectures to come, Patton in many ways proved to be quite correct. Today, we often hear questions like, Why do poor Americans vote for politicians and policies that work against their economic interests? Why do they vote for politicians who cut tax rates for the wealthiest Americans, who are in many ways more inclined towards policies that benefit banks, corporations? Why do poor people vote against their economic interests? And many of the answers to those questions in regards to 21st century American politics come to what Patton was arguing for, that the poor have been urged to think of themselves in commonality with the rich, and that the poor have become less aware of their impoverished status because they have smartphones, flat screen TVs, and air conditioning. That they become less angry, less concerned about the inequities, more willing to support policies that only maintain those inequities because of that common culture. So Patton is a really interesting figure to conclude with here in our final lecture as he anticipates